Let's watch a CNN panel discussing Trump's attacks on civil rights and equality that he is prioritizing to lowering grocery prices and has been implementing as of day one because, of course, race relations are what people voted him in for, not lowering prices.
Donald Trump, his vice president, called her a DEI hire,
Yes.
said that she
I
was
didn't
not.
call her a DEI hire.
I'm not talking about you. I said the people running for office against her called her a DEI hire. To your point, everything is being blamed on DEI. California fires, DEI. Trump's shooting, the rally at the Trump shooting, DEI, even though the head of his detail is a white man. Right-wing commentators talking about plane safety, saying planes are going to crash because of DEI.
But to that,
This is where I wish that like behavioral pattern recognition was a skill that more people had. It's why sociology should be more in the forefront. But if these people are jumping to blame DEI on everything, it's so obviously because they probably have an agenda to do so, much more than it is that DEI is actually causing everything. There's very little things in the world outside of capitalism and Ronald Reagan that you can blame as the cause of mass amounts of issues, especially when, again, as I stress, DEI initiatives began in the 1960s. Nothing has changed about DEI initiatives in the last few years. The last initiative that rolled out about DEI was in 2016, and it was about national intelligence jobs, like federal national intelligence security jobs. The last thing that's been rolled out about DEI in the workforce writ large was literally in the 60s. That alone should show you, again, how unserious this claim is that like, oh, well, now DEI is causing these massive problems. It's just the thing that they can use to attack racial equality right now. Before that, it was CRT's fault. Before that, it was affirmative action's fault. These people, before that, it was Obama's fault, right? These people just have an agenda to tear down racial equality, to tear down anti-discrimination, anti-racism measures. That way they can then have the excuse to undo them, like Trump has with already repealing equal opportunity employment, an executive order that literally just prevents employers from discriminating based on race, sex, or gender. I have a Substack article out about this where I link what's in the executive order, what Trump is repealing. It has nothing to do with quotas. It literally specifically states qualified applicants only cannot consider race of any kind. So overturning it is not preventing anti-white racism or discrimination. He just wants to prevent racial equality. What gives the game away? He didn't repeal the exact same measures that are in place for veterans or the disabled. So his problem is literally just with eroding away these for cultural people, like things with cultural groups, rather than veterans or people who are disabled. It would be discrimination in that too, right? Non-veterans are being discriminated against. Why is that okay? The non-disabled is being discriminated against. Why is that okay? But white people being discriminated against, that's the problem. And this is what I mean when I say on the right, it's just bigots trying to do bigotry, and they're justifying it with these culture war issues that they can like convince their base of, when in reality, a lot of them fall apart with the least bit of thinking.
I don't think DEI was responsible for setting a fire. That's not what they were saying.
Clearly was not.
But
And
that's
it
what
clearly
people
was
say.
not responsible for
But also
being able to put out the fire as well.
Also, I hear you, and I'm glad you don't think discrimination should happen. But our sitting president actually does, because he discriminated against Black people. He did not want them to be able to rent from him, and he is yet to repent for it and say it is wrong. It is something that is woven into our country, and I understand that folks feel like DEI has gone too far, but disparities exist for a reason, and DEI was a tactic to ensure that people had equal opportunity.
And this is the larger issue that you will never hear MAGA talk about when they talk about DEI, because they just want to try and make white people the victims here. They've literally been itching to be able to claim they've been discriminated against because of their race. It's super weird. But even if you think DEI was ineffective as a system or protocols or whatever in and of its own right, that doesn't negate the fact that racial discrimination is still very real and still exists. We still have the applicant study that gets done pretty much like every few years. It was just done, I think, 2022, 2023, with 83,000 fake applications. Half were white people, half were Black people. Everything else on the application was the exact same, from age, qualifications, education experience, criminal background, anything. All of it was exactly the same. And the white applicants on average received 10% more callbacks. In some fields, it was as high as 24%. And Black people, even just among the Black applicants, those with more like traditional white names, like John, Paul, whatever it is, rather than names associated with Black people, like, I don't know, DeQuavius, Jamal, whatever, right? I don't want to trip into racism here with Black names, but they were those with the traditionally white names, white sounding names, were higher or had more likelihood of getting callbacks than even black people who had the more traditionally black names, culture names, whatever you want to call them. We also know 1 in 4 black people report discrimination in the workplace within the last year of them working. Thousands of racial discrimination suits are filed each year. Pay discrepancies still exist among the race. And even with DEI protocols in place, black people are still massively underrepresented in the workforce as a whole, in key industries and in institutions. And the people who want to take DEI away don't want to put anything in its place to address this. They don't even want to admit or accept that it's a problem. They just want black people to exist with this disadvantage and to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, mainly that way so they can always be a little bit ahead.
It's about opening up the doors and removing the barriers that have existed for decades, right? There is a reason why black people in this country only have 15% of the wealth as white people. So what are you telling us? Are you telling us that we are unqualified, unsmart, that we're not actually operating based on merit? Why is it that we have a culture?
There was affirmative
I think you
action
can
for white men
compete
for
against
literally
any white person.
hundreds
There's
of
no-
years in this country. For hundreds of years, there was affirmative action for white men. And to answer your question, because my friend Abel would not, it is not because they're not working hard enough. It's because for centuries, they were locked out of education. For centuries, they were locked out of economic mobility. They couldn't even build wealth. They were set free in this country after being enslaved for hundreds of years with nothing. And then they were subject to another 100 years of Jim Crow.
And the issue here arises when it's white people who have never had to go through these hurdles trying to tell people who have that they don't matter or that they shouldn't hold them back. The simple fact here that it's like not a knock on you to accept or to be able to acknowledge is that, like, as a white person, you could never understand, right? Like, I grew up black in a town where there was 5 of us total. Like, literally in my graduating class, we got more by the time I graduated, but like coming into high school, I think there was literally like 5 or 6 people of color in my graduating class. The experience that I had to deal with because of this growing up, many of which I'll never even talk about publicly, white people just could not understand that. Like, it's just impossible. There is no nuance or anything that could allow them to. And merit wouldn't have prevented the discrimination that I and many other black people are subjected to just because of situations like that. Black people have a fraction of the wealth as white people, a fraction of the property value because they were left out of housing, right? They get paid a fraction for the same work with the same qualifications. They're less likely to get accepted into major universities, even with the same educational application put into these universities. They're underrepresented in STEM fields, underrepresented in Congress. And the right will tell you that all of this is because of merit. It's a skill issue for the black community. If they were just as skilled and just as qualified as the whites, then they'd have the same wealth. They would be just as represented. And it's because they're not, because they're less than, they're less intelligent, less capable. That's why these disparities exist. So why should we go out of our way to help them when they're doing it to themselves? This is the worldview. And it's ignorance and racism working really hard together to create that. And on the other side of that same coin, it's also black people's faults that they're overrepresented in prisons. And this is why I always say, like, once you put the numbers in front of someone, once you give them the proof of discrimination, if they're still denying it, they're racist, because you have to think of what the underlying sentiment there is. If you're looking at these disparities, like black people having 15% of the wealth as white people, lower incomes, less educational outcomes, higher crime rates, and you go, well, yeah, that's just something innate in black people because they're black. Or even subconsciously, if your thought is just something akin to how, oh, well, this blue proves how black people are lazy or less capable and they just need to do much better, then you're absolutely racist. You thinking that because of their race, they're less capable, rather than understanding how the extenuating circumstances they deal with because of their race is what causes these disparities, which is what these protocols are put in to attack, which is needed. I mean, it's more than needed, right? Like, we should absolutely do that in the same justification as why we do it with the disabled, in the same justification for why we do it with veterans, right? Some minority groups in different situations can be vulnerable, right? And vulnerability can look in different ways. And you're vulnerable if you're susceptible to be taken advantage of. This is why we regulate children so hard. We don't let children own property. We don't let children sign contracts. We don't let them do this and this because they can get taken advantage of, right? And it's kind of similar in the workplace, whereas Black people can get taken advantage of. They can get paid less just because they're Black, right? Just because of where they live or this and that. And these are things that we probably should have systems in place to prevent for all people, right? And it's weird that seemingly society agrees with this as you go down the list until you get race. And that's where we draw the line. And I think that's weird. And it speaks to a big underlying issue of how these racial issues never really went away. This racial tension never really went away. It's just kind of been ignored.